I hear the military loves women these days. Guess your job is just sitting in some office counting paper scraps, huh? Because you sure as hell don't look like you've ever held a rifle. The words dropped onto the center of the dining table like a block of lead. Jenna let out a high, breathy snicker, a pathetic, enabling little sound that bounced off the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. Then the air went completely dead. The ambient noise of the suburban house, the low hum of the oversized refrigerator, the manufactured crackle of the gas fireplace seemed to get sucked into a vacuum. I didn't blink. My body did exactly what it was trained to do under a sudden localized threat. My heart rate plummeted, locking in at a steady icy 12 beats per minute. My breathing flattened out, drawing air shallow and silent through my nose. It was a purely physiological response, the body's quiet mechanical preparation to absorb an incoming blast. I kept my eyes dead center on Mark's throat, right on his Adam's apple. I could see the faint, rapid throb of his carotid artery beneath the stiff collar of his designer polo shirt. He was running hot. His pulse was erratic, fueled by 2 fingers of cheap scotch and a desperate, fragile need to break my spine in front of an audience. He wanted to strip away the uniform he couldn't understand. He needed to reduce my entire existence to a punchline so he could feel like the biggest man in the room. Across the table, Uncle Frank froze, the old Marine's shoulders locked into place. His wineglass hovered an inch from his lips, suspended in midair. Frank was the only other person in this room who knew what a severed artery smelled like. Our eyes didn't meet, but the radar pinged. He felt the sudden, violent shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. The space between us turned thick, heavy, unbreathable. 1 second of silence dragged out. It stretched, pulling taut like a steel tripwire before snapping my mind violently backward, dropping me 3 hours deep into the past. 3 hours earlier. The engine of my beat-up Ford groaned a heavy metallic rattle before finally choking out in the driveway. Fairfax, Virginia. A pristine 2-story colonial, wrapped in flawless white vinyl siding, complete with a manicured lawn that smelled like fresh chemical fertilizer. The American dream, financed by a literal nightmare. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long time. The leather cover was cracked and peeling cold against my palms. My thumbs, heavily calloused from years of gripping things meant to tear through flesh and bone, traced the crisp edge of the paper resting in my lap. $6,000. Hazard pay. The exact calculated price of my life for the past 30 days in the sandbox. Every cent of that blood money was about to be endorsed, handed over, and shoved directly into the mortgage of this very house. Jenna's house. The house I kept out of foreclosure while getting shot at in a time zone they couldn't even point to on a map. I folded the check once, pressing my thumbnail down the center to make the crease razor sharp, and shoved it deep into the front pocket of my denim jeans. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed a blue silk button-down shirt, the civilian camouflage. I stripped off my olive drab field jacket. The heavy canvas smelled faintly of fine desert dust, dried sweat, and jet fuel. I tossed it into the back seat like a dead weight. As I pulled the silk shirt over my shoulders, the smooth, expensive fabric caught hard on the jagged, raised scar snaking up the inside of my left forearm. I shivered. A sharp, involuntary muscle spasm shot up my neck. My fingers moved sluggishly over the small, fragile buttons, bottom to top, one by one. Putting on this shirt felt like stepping into a straitjacket. I had to bury the survivor. I had to lock away the predator that kept me breathing in the dirt. Also, I could walk through that oak front door and play the role of the harmless, deadbeat little sister. The one who just couldn't seem to settle down and get a real job. I pushed the car door open. The rusted hinges screamed. I shoved the heavy front door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me like a physical blow. A suffocating wall of burnt garlic butter and heavy roasted meat. It was cloying, nauseating. The kind of aggressive, forced domestic warmth that immediately clogged the back of your throat. "You're late." Jenna didn't walk out of the kitchen. She marched. She was wiping her hands aggressively on a floral apron worn over a silk dress. There was no, "Hello." No, "How was your flight?" No, "Glad you made it back in one piece." She stepped in and threw an arm over my shoulder. A limp, hollow side hug that carried zero weight. It lasted less than a second before she pulled away, her face twisting into a practiced mask of exhausted martyrdom. "Mark's been cleaning all morning," she sighed, projecting her voice just enough to make sure it carried into the formal living room. "He's incredibly stressed, Lola. Mom keeps calling and complaining about how you never visit the care facility, and he's the one taking the brunt of it. We all have responsibilities, you know. A precision strike, guilt, and emotional extortion wrapped in a casual, everyday complaint. The classic translation, your absence for your country is just you running away from us." I didn't argue. I didn't waste the oxygen to defend myself. I just stood up straighter. My spine aligned rigid as steel rebar. My eyes swept the living room. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was hardware level. I checked the corners. I noted the blind spots behind the oversized leather sofa. I checked the sightlines from the bay windows out to the street. 2 exits. Clear. I looked down and kicked off my heavy boots by the door. On the entry mat, 3 pairs of plush memory foam house slippers sat in a meticulously neat row. 1 for Mark, 1 for Jenna, 1 for Caleb, my 19-year-old nephew, who was currently glued to his phone on the couch. None for me. I stepped past them. My bare feet hit the polished hardwood. The floor I literally bought. It was freezing, the cold biting through the soles of my feet like I was walking barefoot on a sheet of solid ice. An outsider in a sanctuary, paid for with my own flesh. Mark walked out of the formal dining room. He didn't say a word. He just stood in the archway, swirling a heavy crystal glass of single malt. The ice cubes clacked against the glass, a sharp, arrogant rhythm. He gave a slight dismissive jerk of his chin, his version of a greeting to the hired help. "Dinner's ready," Jenna announced, rushing past me with a hot basket of bread. She pointed to the far end of the long dining table, the corner seat, shoved right up against the swinging kitchen door, the worst tactical position in the entire room. Boxed-in back, completely exposed, practically sitting in the walkway. The designated chair for the person with no voice. The charity case. I walked over and pulled the chair out. The wood groaned harshly against the floorboards. Plates clattered. Mark didn't just sit down. He descended. He took the head of the table, planting both elbows wide on the mahogany surface, physically expanding his footprint to claim the airspace. Caleb slumped into the chair across from me, barely looking up from a glowing screen. Mark looked down the length of the table at me, his eyes cutting through the thin, greasy steam rising from the roasted chicken in the center. His lips curled into a slow, mocking smirk. Jenna dragged her silver knife across her porcelain plate. A high, screeching scrape that sent a jolt straight to my molars. The suburban king was holding court. This wasn't a family dinner to welcome a sister home. It was a power play. A calculated, deliberate execution of status designed to remind me exactly where I stood in his hierarchy. I sat perfectly still. I kept my hands resting flat on my thighs, hidden beneath the table, out of sight. The smell of garlic butter thickened in the hot air, mixing with the sharp tang of Mark's cologne. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving mine. I knew exactly what this was. I had just walked out of a literal war zone, flown 6,000 miles to pay for the roof over his head, only to sit down right in the crosshairs of an invisible sniper. Mark chewed with his mouth open. It was just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to let the wet slapping sound of masticated chicken leak into the dead air of the dining room. He held court at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows to show off a heavy silver chronograph watch. He was on a roll. Bragging about his third-quarter portfolio yields, complaining about the exorbitant green fees down in Naples for his upcoming golf trip. I sat at the far corner, trapped between the swinging kitchen door and a massive potted fern chewing a piece of dry white meat. The excessive garlic butter coated the roof of my mouth, thick and suffocating. It tasted like ash. I tuned out the sound of his voice. My brain shut down the auditory receptors for his bragging and focused solely on his physical rhythm. I tracked his right hand. His index finger tapped the edge of the mahogany table. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. Erratic. Undisciplined. Anxious. Across the table sat Uncle Frank. Frank didn't talk. He just cut his meat. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the collar frayed at the edges. His spine was permanently curved from age and gravity, but his hands were steady. He held the heavy steak knife like a surgical tool. One clean slice through the beef. No sawing, no dragging the blade, no wasted motion. Frank slowly lifted his head. His eyes, washed out blue and permanently tired, cut through the rising steam of the roasted vegetables and met mine. The radar pinged. It was a silent, high-frequency transmission between two people who knew exactly what a body bag looked like when you zipped it shut. We didn't need to speak. We didn't need to roll our eyes. We both smelled it. The rotting, sickly sweet stench of suburban arrogance rolling off the man at the head of the table. Mark thought he was a titan because he moved numbers on a spreadsheet. Frank and I knew how easily a titan bled out in the dirt. Jenna dropped her fork. It clattered loud against the floral porcelain plate. She let out a heavy rattling sigh, a sound perfectly engineered to suck every ounce of oxygen out of the room and center all attention directly on her. She scooped a bruised wedge of roasted potato and let it fall onto her dish with a wet thud. I had to drive 30 miles down Route 50 last month, she announced, staring at the salt shaker. Mom's prescriptions got messed up again by that idiot doctor. I spent 3 hours arguing with the pharmacist. 3 hours. I'm just so completely drained, Lola. She paused, letting the trap set, letting the guilt simmer. I mean, at least you have it easy, Jenna continued, her voice dripping with poison disguised as fatigue. The military houses you. They feed you. Honestly, our tax dollars are practically paying for your little vacation from the real world. Must be nice not having to deal with the heavy lifting here. A blatant, naked execution. The $6,000 check folded in my front pocket suddenly felt like a hot iron pressing into my thigh. That was my blood, my hazard pay. The exact dollar amount that kept the bank from chaining the front doors of this immaculate, temperature-controlled colonial. I had signed it over so she could complain about a 30-mile drive in an air-conditioned SUV. I had spent the last 30 days sleeping in body armor, jolting awake to the sound of incoming mortars just so she could play the victim over a pharmacy run. I didn't open my mouth. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I gripped my fork. I pressed the pad of my right thumb hard against the sharp, stamped edge of the metal handle. I pushed down. Harder. I let the pain anchor me. I pushed until the skin turned bone white. The thick blue vein running down the back of my hand bulged, throbbing rhythmically against the scarred tissue of my knuckles. Overseas, the enemy buried pressure plates in the sand. You stepped wrong, you lost your legs. Here in the pristine safety of Fairfax, your own flesh and blood buried landmines right in your damn dinner bowl. So what exactly do you do? Caleb leaned forward. His elbows bumped the table, knocking over his water glass. He didn't even notice. His eyes were wide, glowing with that detached cinematic hunger of a 19-year-old college kid whose entire concept of violence came from a flat screen and an Xbox controller. Like, are you a sniper? Caleb asked, grinning. You get confirmed kills. I set my fork down. The metal clicked quietly against the ceramic. I kept my hands above the table, resting my wrists on the edge of the wood. Special operations, I said. 2 words, flat, empty. Mark didn't miss a beat. He snatched the opening, desperate to reassert his dominance over the room. He leaned heavily onto his forearms, tilting his head down to look at me like I was a stain on his expensive rug. Special ops, huh? Mark scoffed, swirling the scotch in his glass. The ice clinked loud and mocking. Sounds highly classified. What does that actually mean in the real world? You brew the coffee for the generals. Make sure the requisition forms are filed on time. He chuckled, a wet, rattling sound in the back of his throat. He looked at Jenna, waiting for her to validate the joke. She offered a weak smile. I guess if you stay deployed long enough, it's a great way to hide from adult responsibilities. Mark pressed his voice, getting louder, filling the space. Just keep avoiding the real work. Easier to play soldier than deal with a sick mother, right? He wanted to peel my skin off. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to raise my voice, to cry, to admit I was a deadbeat sister, dodging life while he footed the emotional bill. His fragile, paper-thin masculinity was threatened by a woman who didn't need his money, so he used his checkbook and his house as a blunt instrument to beat me into submission. The air in the dining room thinned out. The heat pouring from the gas fireplace suddenly felt suffocating, baking the back of my neck. The central HVAC kicked on a low hum that sounded like a drone engine miles above a target. So since you're such a hardened combat veteran, Mark sneered. He pointed his silver fork directly at my chest, jabbing the air with each word. What do they call you out there? I got a tough guy nickname, Hiding Kitten. Jenna giggled, a sharp, pathetic little hiccup. Caleb smirked, looking down at his plate, embarrassed but entertained. I stopped breathing. The civilian shell didn't just crack. It shattered, falling away in jagged, heavy pieces. I leaned back against the wooden chair. Slow, deliberate. It was the posture of a predator that just realized the prey had walked directly into the cage and locked the door from the inside. My eyes snapped up. I bypassed his chest, bypassed his mouth, and locked straight into his pupils. I didn't blink. I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't raise my voice a single decibel. But the sheer freezing mass of the silence pouring off my body hit the room like a shockwave. It choked the space. The giggling stopped instantly. Caleb sat up straight, his smirk vanishing. Even Mark's hand froze, the fork suspended awkwardly in the air, his mouth half open. I let the dead air stretch. I let him drown in it. I watched the sudden, primal flicker of panic twitch behind his eyes as his nervous system registered that he had just kicked a sleeping explosive. I opened my mouth and dropped a slab of concrete right on his chest. Mad dog. Mad dog. The two syllables left my mouth. They didn't echo. They hit the center of the dining table and sat there heavy, dense, and freezing cold. Mark's mocking smile was still plastered across his face. It hadn't even started to fade. His brain was still buffering, trying to process the absolute zero temperature of the room, waiting for a punchline that wasn't coming. Crack! The sound was violent, bone dry. Uncle Frank slammed the heavy base of his crystal wine glass down onto the mahogany wood. The dark red liquid lurched, sloshing over the rim and soaking into Jenna's pristine white table runner. It spread fast, looking exactly like a fresh arterial bleed. Frank's weathered, liver-spotted hands stayed locked around the stem of the glass. His knuckles went completely white. The tendons in his forearm pulled tight, rigid under his thin, papery skin. Apologize. Right now. Frank didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice was low, scraping the bottom of his chest. It sounded like rusted barbed wire being dragged across gravel. Mark flinched, a genuine involuntary full-body twitch. His shoulders pulled up toward his ears. The smug suburban king sitting at the head of the table instantly reverted to a cornered middle management desk jockey. Uncle Frank, come on, Mark stammered, offering a weak, nervous chuckle. He held up one hand palm out, trying to wave off the sudden hostility. I was just messing around. It's a joke. Frank cut him off. The old man's eyes were locked on Mark, washed out blue but sharp as a surgical scalpel. Yeah, you did, Frank growled, leaning forward just an inch. You just took someone else's blood and turned it into a goddamn joke. I sat perfectly still. I didn't shift my weight. I didn't break eye contact with the wall behind Mark's head. I kept my breathing flat. I'm fine, I said. My voice was a dead, empty monotone. Frank snapped his head toward me. For the first time in 10 years, he looked furious with me. He shook his head a single sharp jerk. No, Frank said, pointing a thick, scarred finger at my chest. You are not fine. Mark felt the control slipping. This was his house, his mortgage, his expensive dining set. He gripped the armrest of his chair, the leather squeaking under his sweating palms. His neck flushed a dark, angry red. He jutted his chin out, desperate to cling to his crumbling authority. Are you kidding me right now? Mark raised his voice, the pitch going high and reedy. It was a simple question about a stupid work nickname. You're both acting like I just insulted the flag. Frank stood up. It wasn't a fast movement, but it was massive. The heavy wooden chair scraped violently backward against the hardwood floor. The old Marine straightened his curved spine. He planted his boots wide. Suddenly the faded flannel shirt didn't look like retirement gear anymore. His broad shoulders blocked out the light from the chandelier. A massive, suffocating shadow fell directly across the length of the table, entirely crushing Mark's physical space. That wasn't a question. Frank said, his voice dropping another octave. He planted both fists flat on the table, leaning his weight over the food. That was a challenge. And you stupid son of a bitch, just chose the wrong person to challenge. Nobody breathed. The ambient noise of the house was gone. The gas fireplace seemed to burn cold. Jenna was frozen in her chair, her mouth hanging slightly open, taking short, shallow, panicked breaths through her nose. She looked back and forth between her husband and her uncle, completely paralyzed. The illusion of her perfect Sunday dinner was lying in pieces on the floor. Clink! Caleb's fingers went slack. His silver fork slipped from his hand and hit his porcelain plate. The high-pitched chime rang out in the dead silence like an alarm bell. The kid was pale, his eyes darting between me and Frank, realizing he had just asked about something he had absolutely no right to know. Frank ignored the noise. He kept his weight pressed into his fists, hovering over Mark. "I was in Vietnam," Frank said. He ground the words out slowly. 68, Hugh City. Sometimes names like that get tossed around. You hear them whispered in the dirt. But they aren't for showing off at some dive bar to get free beers. Mark swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed aggressively. The red flush on his neck completely drained away, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. "A name like that?" Frank continued, the volume of his voice so quiet it forced everyone to lean in to hear it. "Is a warning label. It's a shorthand between guys in the shit. It's a way for us to know without asking that the person carrying that name walked straight through absolute hell and did whatever it took to bring our people home." Frank let the silence hang. He let the reality of those words settle over the roasted chicken, the garlic potatoes, and the expensive scotch. "You don't earn a name like that by brewing coffee, Mark," Frank whispered. Mark physically shrank. He pressed his back hard against the leather upholstery of his chair, trying to put as much distance between himself and the old man as physically possible. A bead of cold sweat broke out on his temple, catching the light from the chandelier. The alpha male facade was completely gone, stripped down to the studs. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, darting frantic. He was searching my face for a tell, for a sign that this was an elaborate prank. "So," Mark stammered, his voice cracking. He licked his dry lips. "So, you mean, we're being played? All of this is real?" It was time. I didn't need Frank to fight my battles, but the old man had just pinned the target perfectly to the wall. I slowly placed my hands on the table. I grabbed the edge of my dinner plate and pushed it forward. The ceramic ground harshly against the wood. I sat up straight. The military posture took over, locking my spine into perfect alignment. I looked at Mark. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger required energy. Anger meant I respected him enough to actually care about his opinion. I just felt a heavy, exhausting pity. I looked at him the way you look at a scorpion that just got its stinger ripped out. Harmless, pathetic. Just a noisy bug on the floor. "You don't owe me your aw, Mark," I said. I clipped the words, dropping them like freezing rain. He blinked, flinching at the sound of my voice. "But," I continued, keeping my eyes deadlocked on his, "you need to learn some basic respect. You need to learn it right now before you ever think you have the right to decide if someone else is lying." I held his gaze. The silence in the dining room became absolute. The suffocating smell of garlic butter was fading from my senses. The hum of the refrigerator died out. The polished hardwood floor beneath my bare feet felt like it was turning to sand. Gritty, freezing sand. I wasn't in Fairfax anymore. Mark's pale, terrified face began to blur, replaced by the violent, blinding flash of a mortar round tearing through the Cornwall night. I did not look at Mark anymore. I looked right through him. The warm amber light of the Fairfax dining room started to bleed out. The suffocating smell of roasted chicken, sweet wine, and heavy garlic butter dissolved, replaced by something sharp, bitter. The back of my throat coated over with the taste of sulfur, burning diesel, and fine powdered dirt. My voice came out flat, a dead mechanical frequency. "A rescue op, down in the Cornwall." No emotion, just a casualty report read to a room of civilians who had never missed a meal in their lives. "Intel gave us the green light, said the valley was clear, no ambush." I paused. I let my eyes unfocus, staring past the floral centerpiece on the table. They were wrong. Caleb stopped chewing. A piece of the expensive sourdough bread sat heavy on his tongue, his jaw slack. He was waiting for the movie scene, the slow-motion heroics, the blaring soundtrack. There was no soundtrack, just the deafening, bone-rattling crack of incoming mortars. They hit us from 3 sides. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a serrated blade. Dug into the ridgeline, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades. The sky just tore wide open. White flashes blinding you every 2 seconds. The noise! I stopped. My fingers twitched on the table. The phantom weight of a Kevlar vest pressed down on my shoulders, crushing the air out of my lungs. The noise rips your eardrums right out of your skull. You cannot hear the guy screaming 3 feet next to you. You cannot hear yourself think. Mark sat frozen. The smug financial director was gone. He looked like a cornered animal trapped in his own expensive leather dining chair. We were pinned down. I continued. My gaze drifted to the cooling food on my plate, but I only saw the dark, copper-soaked soil of the valley floor. Half the unit was cut off, trapped in a kill box, bleeding out in the dirt. The radio was just static. Dead screaming static and guys choking on their own blood over the comms. Jenna covered her mouth, her manicured nails dug deep into her cheeks. Her perfect Sunday dinner was rotting right in front of her. Command came over the net, I said. Clear as day. The order was a full immediate fallback. Break contact, withdraw. Get the surviving assets out of the valley. Mark blinked, his chest heaving. The concept of losing was entirely foreign to him. He lived in a world of bailouts, padded bank accounts, and safety nets. What about the guys who were hit? Mark stammered. His voice was a pathetic, reedy squeak. The wounded. I raised my eyes. My pupils dilated, locking onto his face with cold mechanical precision. The rules of war are not written for your comfort, Mark, I said. When you cannot save everyone, you save the majority. The math is simple. The math is brutal. The order was to leave them behind. Write them off as a total loss. Across the table, Uncle Frank lowered his head. His heavy, gnarled hand closed tightly around the stem of his wine glass. He knew the math. He knew the trolley problem. It was the crushing, soul-destroying calculus that no guy in a tailored suit would ever have to face. Frank closed his eyes, hiding the ghosts of Hugh City that were currently screaming in his own head. But, Jenna gasped, her voice trembling, desperate to find a happy ending. You made it back. You survived. Yeah, Jenna, I said, a hollow sound escaping my throat. I survived. Mark leaned forward, desperate to make the numbers work. Desperate for a clean, logical narrative he could process. Wait, did you go back for them alone? I gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. The truth was ugly. It was not a tale of bravery. It was absolute, borderline insanity. I did not get a medal for following orders, I said. The words tasted like rust. I did not get a parade. I broke protocol. I violated direct commands. I risked a full court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, and a one-way ticket to a military prison in Leavenworth. I could feel the cold steel of the rifle in my hands. Not my rifle. My rifle was jammed with sand and grit. I had ripped a fresh one out of the hands of a 20-year-old kid from Ohio who was missing the lower half of his jaw. His blood was still warm, slicking the plastic grip. I grabbed a dead man's weapon. I said, my voice dropping lower, grinding against the absolute silence of the room. And I ran straight back into the fire. Caleb was completely white. The video game fantasy was dead. He was staring at a monster. I did not follow orders, I told them. I knew the price. I knew exactly what it would cost my career. And I went back anyway. Mark physically collapsed. The last remaining pieces of his arrogant suburban armor cracked and fell away, leaving a terrified small man sitting at the head of a very long table. His shoulders slumped forward, pulling his expensive polo shirt tight across his back. His breathing was shallow, erratic. He looked at me, really looked at me, and finally saw the absolute, crushing weight I carried into his house. His jaw trembled. That is why... Mark mumbled the words, catching in his dry throat. That is why they call you Mad Dog. He thought it was an insult, a joke about a vicious, mindless killer. I ground my teeth together. The muscles in my jaw knotted hard as stone. I pressed my hands flat against the mahogany table, leaning my weight into the solid wood. They do not call me that because I'm a killer, Mark, I said. Every single syllable was a hammer strike. They call me that because I refuse to stop, because I refuse to listen to reason, because I would not accept leaving my own people in the dirt just to keep my own ass safe. I held his gaze. I watched the realization sink in. I spent my Thanksgiving hauling mangled bodies out of a ditch while taking heavy machine gun fire so a guy like Mark could sit in an air-conditioned room and complain about his golf fees. I sold my soul in the Korangal so they could sleep through the night in Fairfax. The dining room descended into a dead, suffocating silence. The verdict was delivered. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to throw a punch. The raw, bleeding truth just crushed the life out of every single petty, ignorant grievance they held against me. Mark just stared at his plate. The expensive scotch sat untouched, the ice completely melted. The roasted chicken grew cold. I slowly pulled my hands off the table. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, and sat waiting in the dark silence. The dining room table was a graveyard of cold grease. The six-figure ego that had been strutting around the room for the last hour was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell sitting in an expensive leather chair. Mark didn't look up. His eyes stayed glued to the bottom of his empty crystal glass, his soft white fingers tracing the rim over and over in a frantic, meaningless circle. The big-shot corporate director who spent his weekends dropping $300 on a golf course in Naples had vanished. He looked small, shrunken. I thought you were just talking big, Mark muttered. His voice didn't have that booming boardroom authority anymore. It was thin, papery, a pathetic, reedy sound that barely made it across the mahogany wood. He cleared his dry throat, trying to find some scrap of dignity left in the wreckage of his own house. How did you even live through something like that? I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang in the air, rotting alongside the leftovers. Slowly, I pushed my chair back. The wooden leg slid across the polished floorboards with a sharp, loud screech that made Jenna jump. I stood up. My spine was perfectly straight, my shoulders locked back, fluid and mechanical. My hands didn't shake. I looked down at my plate, picked up my heavy silver fork, and let it drop. Clank. The metal hit the porcelain with a dead final thud. I didn't live through it, I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any anger or heat. It was just a statement of fact. I carry it with me. No yelling, no dramatic speeches, no satisfaction. I didn't need to punish him because Mark wasn't even worth the ammunition. The utter indifference in my eyes was the final bullet that put his fragile suburban pride out of its misery. He flinched, his head sinking lower into his collar, unable to look at the monster he had tried so hard to mock. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room. My bare feet made no sound against the wood. I pushed through the kitchen, bypassed the living room, where the television was still muttering some useless football game, and stepped onto the back porch. The heavy aluminum screen door let out a sharp, rusty groan before slamming shut behind me. Thwack! The November Virginia night air hit me like a physical slap. It was freezing sharp and clean. It rushed into my lungs, violently stripping away the suffocating, oily stench of burnt garlic butter and cheap cologne that had been choking me for hours. I walked over to the wooden railing, the rough grain biting into my palms, and leaned my weight against it. Out here, the suburbs were quiet. Just a row of identical colonial houses with identical manicured lawns, all tucked safely away behind a wall of ignorance. I reached down into the pocket of my jeans. My thumb caught the sharp folded edge of the $6,000 check. The money meant to pay for the very roof over my head right now. The money Jenna took with one hand while using the other to point out all my flaws. I pulled it out halfway, my calloused fingers feeling the flimsy paper. Behind me, the screen door hinges screamed again. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I recognized the heavy, uneven drag of the boots. Uncle Frank stepped onto the porch. He had an old, faded wool cardigan thrown loosely over his broad, hunched shoulders. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer some Hallmark Channel sympathy. He just walked up to the railing, planting his large, weathered hands a few feet away from mine. Two soldiers, two different wars, standing together in the dark, breathing in the frost. We didn't need to talk. We shared the quiet, heavy understanding of people who knew what a body looked like when the life got dragged out of it. Frank reached into his flannel shirt pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver Zippo. Flip clack. The heavy metal top swung open. His thumb struck the flint, and a sharp yellow flame flickered into the darkness, casting deep, jagged shadows across the heavy wrinkles of his face. He lit an unfiltered cigarette, took a long, slow drag, and let the smoke cupped in his palm drift into the cold air. The smell of cheap tobacco blended instantly with the winter frost. "You handled that right, kid," Frank said. He didn't look at me. He just watched the smoke disappear into the trees. Coming back to the world, it's never a clean ride. It's always a bitch. I put my hands back into my pockets, my shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. Tonight was worse than a 12-mile march in full kit. I muttered, my throat dry. Frank let out a low, gravelly chuckle that turned into a rough cough. "Yeah, because out there you know where the enemy's digging in. You got a map? Here. The worst hits come from the people sitting across the table. The ones carrying the exact same last name." He took another drag, the cherry of the cigarette glowing bright orange in the dark. I looked down at the dark grass below the porch. The sheer exhaustion was settling deep into my bones now. It wasn't physical. It was the mental drain of trying to play the part of the good little sister. The tired routine of hiding the scars and watering down the truth, just to make civilian life comfortable for people who were too soft to handle the reality. Frank shifted his weight, his old boots creaking against the porch floorboards. He turned his head, his washed-out blue eyes locking onto the side of my face with a heavy, unmovable weight. "Nights like this. They're necessary. Lola." The old Marine said, his voice dropping into a rough, rhythmic rumble. "You gotta set the parameters." I kept my jaw tight, listening to the wind rattle the dead leaves in the yard. "Listen to me." Frank pressed, pointing the glowing tip of his cigarette toward the glowing windows of the dining room behind us. "The people inside that house, they don't need to understand what you did out there. They're never going to get it. Their brains aren't wired for it. They think the world is safe because they got a good credit score." He snapped the Zippo shut with a loud metallic click that echoed in the yard. "But starting tonight," Frank growled, his eyes boring into mine, "they damn well have to learn to respect what they can't understand. You don't let them slide anymore. Not about the uniform. Not about the price." Something inside my chest gave way. A tight, rusted gear that had been jammed for months finally snapped into place. The phantom weight of the valley seemed to lift just a fraction, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Frank was right. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't need their validation to know the worth of the blood I had spilled. My hand tightened inside my pocket. My fingers wrapped around the $6,000 paper check, squeezing hard. I ground my knuckles together until the paper collapsed, tearing and buckling under the force, crushing it into a tight, useless ball of trash. The days of letting them weaponize their petty lifestyle against my sacrifice were over. The debt was settled, but the terms of the contract had just been rewritten in steel. I looked back at the glass door of the kitchen. Inside, the silhouettes of Mark and Jenna were moving slow, hesitant, and completely terrified of the silence waiting for them at the table. I pulled my hands out of my pockets, left Frank alone with his smoke, and gripped the handle of the screen door. 7 in the morning. The air inside the colonial house had completely changed its density. Last night, the oxygen was thick, choked with the smell of roasted meat, cheap scotch, and suburban arrogance. This morning, it was just quiet. The heavy, sterile silence of a battlefield after the artillery finally stops firing. I stood in the guest bedroom and pulled the heavy brass zipper of my olive drab canvas duffel bag. Zizzed. The sound was sharp, mechanical. I didn't have much to pack. 3 t-shirts, 1 pair of denim jeans. The blue civilian silk shirt I wore to dinner was shoved carelessly at the bottom, crushed under the weight of my combat boots. I wouldn't be needing the camouflage anymore. I hoisted the bag over my shoulder. The thick nylon strap bit into my collarbone, familiar and grounding. I walked down the carpeted stairs. My footsteps were heavy, deliberate. I wasn't sneaking out. I wasn't trying to make myself small to avoid waking the house. I took up exactly as much space as I had earned. The kitchen was flooded with sharp, blinding morning sunlight, cutting through the plantation shutters. Jenna was standing by the marble island. She wasn't wearing the floral apron or the silk dress from the night before, just a plain oversized sweater. She didn't rush over to me. She didn't throw a hollow limp arm around my neck. When I dropped my duffel bag by the doorway with a loud, heavy thud, she visibly stiffened her shoulders, pulling tight. She reached for a ceramic mug, poured it full from the glass carafe, and turned around. She held the mug with both hands, extending it toward me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the granite countertop, strictly avoiding my gaze. It was a completely different posture, cautious, measured. It was the physical manifestation of fear distilled into a cup of black coffee. There was no sighing about a 30-mile drive to the pharmacy. There was no casual, passive-aggressive guilt trip about our mother's care facility. The endless stream of emotional blackmail had been permanently severed. The territory had been reclaimed, and she knew exactly where the new property line was drawn. I took the mug. The porcelain was scalding hot against my calloused palm. I took a slow sip. Black, bitter, unfiltered. No sugar to mask the edge. I let the harsh heat slide down the back of my throat, feeling an absolute, unbreakable sense of control settle deep into my chest. For years, I'd walked into this house trying to shrink myself, trying to fold my edges away so I wouldn't puncture their perfect, catalog-ready lifestyle. I let Jenna treat me like a charity case because it was easier than fighting a war on two fronts. But that was over. I wasn't carrying their insecurities anymore. "Lola!" The voice came from the archway. Mark stepped out of the living room shadows. The transformation was jarring. The tailored suit trousers and the rolled-up sleeves showing off the silver chronograph watch were gone. He wore a faded gray t-shirt and a pair of worn-out sweatpants. His shoulders, usually puffed out to claim maximum airspace, were slumped forward, completely deflated. The corporate apex predator had been reduced back to a tired, middle-aged man who realized he wasn't the most dangerous thing in the room. He stopped walking exactly 2 steps away from me. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was an instinctual, primal calculation. He kept a safe physical buffer, recognizing the threat level he had blindly ignored the night before. Mark started. His voice was raw, lacking the booming resonance he used to order people around. He swallowed hard, looking at the floorboards before forcing his eyes up to meet mine. "I want to do better. I need to do better." I didn't blink. I took another sip of the bitter coffee, waiting for him to finish. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice dropping into a quiet, raspy whisper. "Thank you for not breaking my jaw last night." It was a genuine confession. The absolute, unfiltered honesty of a man whose toxic, arrogant shell had been systematically crushed into powder. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it. He was just acknowledging the mercy he had been given. I kept my face entirely blank, a flat, unreadable mask. I didn't smile to ease his discomfort. I didn't tell him it was okay because it wasn't okay. The scars were still there. The betrayal was still real. But the dynamic had permanently shifted. I was the one holding the gavel now. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. "That is enough," I said. 3 words, cold and final. I set the half-empty coffee mug down on the marble counter. I reached down, grabbed the strap of my heavy canvas bag, and slung it over my shoulder. As I turned toward the front door, Mark stepped forward. He hesitated, his arm twitching at his side before he slowly extended his right hand. It wasn't a fake, obligatory family hug. It was a formal truce. I stopped. I looked at his outstretched hand, then looked at his face. I reached out and grabbed his hand. His skin was soft, smooth, untouched by anything sharper than a paperclip. I gripped his palm and squeezed. Not hard enough to break bones, but just enough pressure to let the thick, rigid calluses of my fingers grind against his skin. The permanent physical scars of gripping a rifle in 120-degree heat. I let him feel the physical friction of the artillery, burns the jagged edges of a life he would never have the stomach to survive. His fragile masculinity had demanded a victim last night, but in the cold light of day, he finally realized he had tried to bully a predator. "Thank you," Mark whispered again, flinching slightly under the pressure of my grip. "For not walking away from this family. For not abandoning us." I held his hand for one more second, letting the weight of his words hang in the dead air. I looked straight through his eyes, directly into the hollow core of his chest. "You gave me a reason not to..." I said, clipping the words sharp and clean. Do not lose it. I let go of his hand. I didn't look back at Jenna. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the freezing November morning. The cold air felt like a baptism. I walked down the concrete driveway toward my rusted Ford. The blinding morning sun was bouncing violently off the dented hood, casting a harsh, brilliant light over the flawless suburban street. I threw my canvas bag into the passenger seat, climbed behind the steering wheel, and slammed the heavy metal door shut. The rusted hinges screamed one last time before sealing me inside. I turned the key. The old engine roared to life, a deep, aggressive, mechanical growl that completely shattered the fragile, pristine silence of Fairfax. It was a blue-collar sound, rough, unpolished, and completely out of place in this zip code. I dropped the transmission into gear, my hand resting naturally on the cracked leather shift knob. As the truck rolled forward, I glanced up at the rearview mirror. The frame of the mirror perfectly captured the colonial house. Mark and Jenna were standing together on the front porch. They weren't waving. They weren't forcing fake enthusiastic smiles. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in a quiet, solemn reverence. Watching me leave, the mirror pushed them further and further backward, shrinking the house, shrinking the neighborhood until they were nothing but a tiny speck in the glass. I looked away from the mirror. I looked out through the windshield at the wide, empty road stretching out in front of me. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. You don't need the world to understand your story to prove that you exist. You don't need to rip yourself open and bleed out on a dining room table just to make people respect your journey. We all carry invisible ghosts. We all have a Korengal Valley that we walked through alone. The people who haven't seen the dark will never understand the weight of your armor, and that is fine. It is not your job to educate their ignorance. True greatness does not lie in how loud you scream to demand justice. It doesn't live in the arguments you win or the tables you flip. It lies in your capacity to remain silent. It lies in how long you can hold your ground, breathing quietly in the dark, waiting for the arrogant to trip over their own absolute ignorance. You just have to stand firm, set your iron boundaries, and refuse to let anyone weaponize your goodness against you. Keep your composure. Hold on to your quiet dignity. Because the truth, the cold, unshakable truth, is always the most lethal weapon in the room. And if this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more videos.